There are lots of stories in Chinese martial arts about different myths and legends, where things come from, but can we actually believe those stories? So let's talk about some of the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. My name's Matt. If you're new here, this is a channel about Chinese martial arts. So if, like me, you've been doing Chinese martial arts for a while, you would have heard all sorts of stories about the origins of this, or what happened to the Shaolin Temple here and all the rest of it. But it's kind of nice to know what the actual truth is, or at least what the evidence says. That's what I got interested in, and so because of that I've purchased and have read, and we'll talk about this week, Chinese Martial Arts, A Historical Outline. It's really interesting. If you haven't read anything about the actual evidence-based history of Chinese martial arts opposed to what some bloke down the pub said, this is a great place to start. I mean, the clues in the title, A Historical Outline. It doesn't go into huge amounts of depth about everything, because quite frankly in a book that thick you wouldn't have time, but it is a really interesting book and it certainly enlightened me. What's interesting is certainly it's got academic references in it, which is a good start for a book on Chinese martial arts. There's lots of historical examples backed by sources, and so because of the footnotes and bibliography here, I've now got some sources so I'm going to go off and read. In fact, from reading this book I immediately went and ordered another couple that are listed here, just because I've got a little taste and I want to find out some more, so it's really, really cool. So let's talk about some of the bits in the book. Why, obviously, I think you should read it, because I'm not going to read and record a video about something I think is a waste of time. But also, if you don't have time to read the book, it might give you some idea for further research as to maybe how to inform yourself a bit more. At the end of the day, in Chinese martial arts, the best we can do is be informed, to stop perpetuating myths, so to speak, and just think of things as folklore if they are folklore, opposed to necessarily historical fact. So let's start at the beginning. A monk came from India. He knew some yoga. He taught it to some monks. The monks did that yoga a lot, and it eventually turned into some kung fu, so Chinese martial art. And then from there, they spread this yoga kung fu to the rest of China, which before that didn't do any fighting, and after that knew Shaolin Kung Fu. So let's try and dispel some ignorance, shall we? There's so many cool things in this book. As with all these book reviews, I'm not just going to regurgitate everything in the book, because I don't think that's fair on the author. If you want to find out more, buy the book, give it a read, it's really cool. Let's just cover the caveat to all of this. I'm not a trained historian. I'm sort of going on the basis that a trained historian who's written this book, David Ross, has done his homework. I can't take everything here as fact, because that's not how scholarly works work. Certainly, it's a good start, isn't it? So, everything I'm going to say here, if we're talking about dispelling ignorance, I can't say is absolute fact, but it's a good start. Let's jump in and let's talk about what was in this book. Oh, by the way, if you are well informed and you've got anything to add, put it in the comments below, because I am interested. If there's any other books that you think are really cool like this and you think I should go and read, please let me know, put them in the comments. Okay, so firstly, let's start off with the author. The author has done, I think, 30 years of Chinese martial arts. If it's longer, whatever, let me know in the comments below. Speaks 3 dialects of Chinese, it's pretty good going. Has done a degree in, don't know if it's Chinese history or anyway, he's studied Chinese martial arts in an academic context, so it's a good start opposed to someone who's heard a few stories. So the book doesn't really mess about. It sort of addresses head on the fact that there are a lot of myths in Chinese martial arts, that we hear these myths, that they get perpetuated, and lots of the origin stories as to where a martial art came from, they're not true. But why do they come about, and why do they keep getting perpetuated? Well, sometimes back in the day for fame, or for some sort of legitimacy as to, my art is one of the Shaolin arts, and you can't necessarily say, oh yeah, I made it up. It sounds better if it's from Shaolin, regardless of what the actual truth is. And of course, if you're trying to entice students to your society or martial arts hall, a brand name like Shaolin, that's quite useful. It's going to get you some money probably. So already you can start to think about, in context, knowing what humans are like, opposed to some fabled monks. So for obvious reasons, Chinese martial arts are used by the military. That's where they're developed. People with any fighting styles can bring that to the military as well, and troops get trained and techniques get invented. But when we talk about martial arts in that context, we are talking about riding on horseback as well, troop movements, shooting a bow and arrow and all the rest of it. It's only later on do we start to think of open hand Chinese martial arts. And Chinese culture, Chinese history has had all manner of social upheaval and lots of people who basically need to learn how to defend themselves or even fight for money or whatever. There's lots of people learning these particular various different skills and tactics and ways of fighting in order to either protect themselves or, like I say, earn some money. And then after a battle or after a war is over, those people then go home and then can teach those arts or get hired as bodyguards or all the rest of it and disperse throughout society. So it's not the Shaolin origin story that is often perpetuated. It's just people fight for resources, for fame or whatever it is. They need to use violence for that. So it's not that they needed a monk to turn up and teach them how to fight. It's just part of being human, sadly. That's where a lot of Chinese martial arts were developed. So there's an interesting thing that comes up a few times and is worth bearing in mind, in that the idea of a martial art being effective and working. See, if you're on the battlefield, you kind of want to win. Or not even just the battlefield, if you're a bodyguard or a hired hitman or whatever else it is, you want your martial skill to work, because if not, there's could be dire consequences. And historically, feats of strength are considered part of martial arts. So if they're in military examinations where there's physical aspects of that examination where you have to show your military prowess by shooting arrows, also includes feats of strength, because it was accepted that if you're stronger, you're going to have an advantage over your opponent. People who did Chinese martial arts and had that as a skill on their CV, so to speak, could use that in other professions if the military wasn't somewhere they wanted to go to. There were gentry who did martial arts, we'll talk about in a sec, but people were generally looked down upon if they were just fighters, which is quite interesting. So those types of people then became part of the Jiang, the rivers and lakes, because of their various professions. Would have to travel. If you're thinking you're a armed escort or a bodyguard or even a martial arts teacher or a medicine peddler, you would be travelling around. You'd be more likely to be travelling around. Because of that, they were part of the Jiang subculture of other people who travel around. So maybe some of them were from less positive backgrounds, but some of them were just like opera troupes and things like that. So you can start to see why Chinese opera comes up a lot, given the performances and all the rest of it. So Chinese opera and their relationship with martial arts is there as well. And also those people who are part of the Jiang subculture weren't subject to the same family ties and structural expectations because they're travelling around so much. So to a degree, although they had maybe not particularly stable life, they were freer in other ways. Something that I guess I hadn't thought of and I learnt from the book is the idea of the elite, be it just wealthy people or even local governments. So if they had resources of any kind, they kind of want to protect them. And because of that, they would have hired, we'd say militias to protect those interests. But if you think of somewhere else that has interests, somewhere else that was rich and had interests, temples. So the Shaolin Temple is an example of the martial monks being there not needing to fight to practice and stretch their bodies after hours of meditation, but because the monastery was a wealthy landowner and needed to protect its assets. So that's quite interesting. It doesn't say the martial arts are any less effective or anything else like that, but it makes you start to question and think about these things. So that's really, really cool. I learned a lot from that. Now, something that does come up a lot in the book and is a huge part of society in China was these large groups of men with not much else to do. So, if you've got droughts and famines and stuff, sometimes it happens with natural disasters and you lose a crop, you're going to have people who are under or unemployed. There was female infanticide, so because men were seen as more preferable to have a boy than a girl if you're having kids, sadly lots of baby girls were killed, and so you had an increased population of men, and also you had polygamy, so wealthy men would have more than one wife. So because of that, you ended up with large amounts of men in a society that's violent and has lots of social upheaval. those people are either going to get employed as militia for local gentry or government or something like that, or, as often happened, was as a reaction against the elite, if you want to think of it that way, they would form their own social groups. And that's when it starts to get interesting, when you get like you start thinking jumping hundreds of years, but the Boxer Rebellion, or going back to the Tien Di Hui, the Heaven and Earth Society. It's interesting how there's all these, a constant thing that happens, this churn of rebellions and repressions and rebellion and repression, and so you've got these different groups fighting. So all these people are doing and learning Chinese martial arts, and if you get employed in one of those places, or if you join one of those places, so if we take the societies as an example, one way to entice people to join their society is to say, oh, we'll give you martial arts tuition, we will learn this Shaolin style. I use Shaolin as an example, but they could have said other styles. And from that they can get enticed, but some martial arts are more likely to be spread through that as well. So mention the Tien Di Hui, the Heaven and Earth Society, which is quite prevalent in Fujian, so hence my interest because of Chinese martial arts from Fujian. But Ross mentions that the origin story of even this society, not martial arts they're teaching, but that society was formed by 5 monks who left the Shaolin Temple after it was burned. So if you look at the historical record, the society was actually formed well over 100 years after the temple was burnt down. As I mentioned, Shaolin, or the promise of a Shaolin martial art, or links to Shaolin, it's a brand, and it was useful for people for the last however many 100 years to use it as a recruitment tool. But what's also interesting is, particularly in the Qing dynasty, where people would have the ponytails, it would have been easier if you were a monk, or at least if you appeared to be a monk, I should say. It would be easy if you appeared to be a monk to travel around. People are less likely to stop you. You can shave your head and not have to have a ponytail. Yeah, so you start to see why some people, oh, so-and-so was a monk from blah, 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 blah. Well, were they? And it starts to raise questions, and as I say, it's prompted me to think, actually I need to do some more research on this. I'm not saying this is all gospel entirely, but it puts it in context, and from certainly some other preliminary things I've read, that is Chinese history. Hi guys, sorry to interrupt, I'm just editing the video. It's getting a little bit long, so what I'm going to do is split it in half so that this section is going to be the historical context, and then next week I'll release some of my favourite bits of the book, and then that'll have some stuff about internal styles, and then there's a couple of awesome competitions that happened back in the 20s as well. So when that's available, that'll be linked to the screen, but if it isn't on there, go and check out some of my other videos about some of the book reviews I've done, or just some of the other videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.